You thought you could get away with this? You underestimated Blackshore. Now clean out your desk and get out!
Please, I need this job.
The termination notice hit Maribel's hands 10 minutes after Mr. Sterling finished screaming in her face. He stood in the center of the corporate cubicles, his tailored gray suit sharp, his luxury watch catching the fluorescent light as he pointed a trembling finger at the door. He had no idea. The disposable Maid he just humiliated in front of the entire office was the fiancé of Ryu Blackshore, the silent owner of the hotel group and the most feared name in the city's underground. In 72 hours, Ryu would systematically dismantle Sterling's life, his career, his reputation, his secret bank accounts, everything. All because Sterling chose the wrong woman to bully. But here is the part that changes everything. The destruction of one arrogant man wasn't the end. It was the birth of the Knox Foundation, a legacy that now protects thousands of workers from executive abuse. Now, let's get into this. Maribel stood between the stacks of paperwork on Sterling's desk, her neat cornrows bowed, tears tracking down her cheeks as she gripped the paper with both hands. Her lips trembled as she looked down at the words, "Fired immediately." 10 minutes ago, she was a dedicated employee with a steel trap work ethic. Now, she was being branded a thief for a crime Sterling himself staged. Sterling leaned in, his breath hot against her ear, invading her personal space to assert his dominance. He told her she was nothing, thinking she was powerless. He didn't see the silent observer in the back hallway, a man with a phone already at his ear, face pale with the weight of the coming storm. Because Ryu Blackshore just heard the words that would trigger a war. "Sir, they're hurting her." Sterling had 80 minutes of peace left. To anyone looking at them through the window of the dim-sum parlor in Queens, they were just another couple. Ryu Blackshore sat with a preternatural stillness, his dark coat expensive enough to buy the entire block, yet he blended into the shadows like he was born from them. Across from him, Maribel was a burst of morning light, her neat cornrows catching the overhead glow, her hands still smelling faintly of the lemon-scented industrial bleach she used at the hotel. Ryu watched her eat, his eyes tracking the way her shoulders dropped when she finally relaxed. He pushed a small, velvet box across the scarred wooden table, not a ring, but a key. "I bought the penthouse on 57th, he said, his voice a low, melodic rumble that sounded like gravel over silk. "It has a private elevator. You wouldn't have to walk through the lobby. You wouldn't have to wear that uniform ever again, Maribel." Maribel didn't reach for the key. Instead, she adjusted the white collar of her maid's uniform, smoothing a crease that wasn't there. "It's a beautiful key, Ryu. But it doesn't open the door to anything I built myself." Ryu leaned forward, his jaw tensing. To the world, he was a ghost, a man who moved mountains and erased enemies with a single nod. To Maribel, he was just the man who stayed up late to make sure she got home safe. "You're working 12-hour shifts for a man who doesn't know your last name," Ryu countered, his tone bordering on a plea. "I have billions in accounts you can't even imagine. Let me be your floor, Maribel. Let me be the thing that catches you." "I like the dirt under my fingernails," she said with a soft, stubborn smile, reaching across to squeeze his hand. Her palm was calloused, a stark contrast to his manicured, lethal fingers. "I love you, Ryu. I love the way you protect me. But I need to know that if all your Blackshore empires turn to dust tomorrow, I could still put bread on our table. I need my own money. My own name. My own sweat." Ryu sighed, the sound heavy with the frustration of a man who could control everything except the woman he adored. He knew the dangers of the world better than anyone, knew that predators liked to hunt in the very hotels Maribel cleaned. But he also knew that her independence was the very thing that had made him fall for her when she'd stepped in front of a stray bullet meant for him a year ago. "One more month," he murmured, knowing it was a lie they both told themselves. "One more month," she promised, kissing his cheek before standing up to catch the 6 a.m. bus. As she walked away, Ryu's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't look at it. He just watched her go, the sun retreating from his shadow, unaware that the honest job she moved toward was about to become a battlefield. The following Tuesday, the atmosphere inside the Grand Celestia felt thick with a tension Maribel couldn't quite name. She spent her morning in the West Wing, a silent ghost in a dark uniform, scrubbing away the traces of people who never looked her in the eye. She didn't mind the invisibility, it was the price of the clean money she defended so fiercely to Ryu just days before. In the executive offices on the 4th floor, Mr. Sterling was drowning. He sat behind his mahogany desk, the fluorescent lights reflecting off the sweat beads on his forehead. His luxury watch, a platinum piece that cost more than Maribel earned in 2 years, was gone. He hadn't lost it. He had handed it over to a man in a windowless basement in Atlantic City at 3 a.m. to buy himself another week on a debt he could never repay. But the insurance company needed a police report, and the hotel board needed a villain. Sterling looked at the duty roster. His eyes landed on the name Knox, Maribel. He remembered the way she'd refused to flinch when he'd barked at her for a missed smudge on a mirror the week prior. He hated that quiet dignity, it felt like a challenge to his authority. To Sterling, she was the perfect target, a woman on a work visa, a face in the crowd, someone whose word would never carry the weight of a man in a tailored gray suit. He waited until the mid-morning lull before he began his performance. He tore open his desk drawers, scattering papers like confetti, and began a practiced, guttural roar that echoed into the hallway. "My watch! It's gone!" He marched into the hallway, his jaw tense and his salt and pepper hair perfectly slicked back to maintain the facade of a victim. He found the head of security near the elevators. "Check the cameras. No, better yet, check the logs for who cleaned my office this morning. I had it on my desk before my breakfast meeting. Now it's gone." He knew the cameras in the executive suite had a blind spot he'd conveniently arranged for his own private meetings. He just needed a narrative. By the time Maribel was finishing a suite on the 6th floor, the trap had been meticulously laid. Sterling didn't just want his insurance money, he wanted to break the woman who dared to look him in the eye without fear. As Maribel stepped into the service elevator, she felt her phone vibrate. It was a text from her supervisor, "Report to Sterling's office immediately. Now." She smoothed her cornrows, tucked her shirt into her waistband, and took a deep breath. She had no idea that the honest job she loved was about to become the site of her public execution. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a clinical indifference as Maribel walked into the executive back office. The usual rhythmic tapping of keyboards had ceased, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. Mr. Sterling wasn't in his private office, he was standing in the center of the cubicle farm, surrounded by staff who kept their eyes glued to their monitors, too terrified to look up. "There she is," Sterling's voice boomed, cutting through the air like a blade. He didn't wait for her to reach him. He stormed toward her, his jaw tense and his salt and pepper hair catching the harsh light. Maribel stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Sir. My supervisor said." "Your supervisor said you're a thief." Sterling roared, closing the distance until he was inches from her face. He invaded her personal space, his physical dominance a calculated weapon. He was so close she could smell the expensive coffee on his breath and see the aggressive pulse in his neck. He raised a hand, pointing a finger directly at her eyes. "My watch. Gone. Right after you finished my floors." "I didn't touch your watch, Mr. Sterling," Maribel said, her voice trembling but her gaze holding steady. "I was only in there for 5 minutes. 5 minutes is all a scavenger needs." He shoved a document toward her chest, the termination notice. Maribel's hands shook as she took it, her eyes blurring as they scanned the bold, cruel text, "Fired immediately." Inappropriate conduct and theft of property. Sign it, he hissed, leaning in even closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl that only she could hear. Sign it and leave quietly, or I'll make sure the police are waiting at your apartment. I'll see to it your visa is revoked before the sun goes down. The humiliation hit her like a physical blow. The tears she had been fighting finally broke, tracking hot and fast down her cheeks. Her shoulders hunched inward, her posture collapsing under the weight of the public execution. She looked down at the paper, her neat cornrows bowed, her lips pulling downward in a silent sob. She felt frozen, a vulnerable target in a dark uniform while the man in the gray suit loomed over her, basking in his own manufactured rage. Get your things, Sterling commanded, turning to the room so everyone could witness his authority. And someone call security. I want her escorted out the service entrance. We don't allow criminals to walk through the lobby. Maribel clutched the damp paper to her chest, the ink smearing under her thumb. She turned, her vision tunneled by shame, and began the long walk past the whispering cubicles. Sterling stood behind her, a smug smile finally touching his lips as he checked his bare wrist. He had won. Or so he thought, unaware that the silent shadow in the back hallway had already recorded the entire display, and that the man Maribel was walking toward wasn't just her fiancé, he was the reckoning Sterling never saw coming. The service entrance of the Grand Celestia opened onto a narrow, damp alleyway that smelled of exhaust and discarded crates. Maribel emerged with her head down, clutching the tattered cardboard box containing her few personal belongings, a spare name tag, a hand lotion she'd bought on sale, and the damp termination notice that felt like a brand on her skin. She didn't look back at the security guard who let the heavy steel door slam shut behind her. Waiting at the end of the alley was the matte black sedan. It sat idling, a silent, predatory shape in the gray New York drizzle. As Maribel approached, the back door opened automatically. She slid onto the leather seat, the scent of expensive sandalwood and cold air immediately enveloping her. Ryu didn't say a word at first. He was looking out the opposite window, his profile etched in sharp, dangerous lines against the city lights. He looked like the man the newspapers feared, the ghost of Blackshore, who moved through the world without leaving a footprint. But as the car pulled away, he turned his head, and his gaze landed on Maribel's face. She tried. She forced a small, fragile smile and stared straight ahead, her fingers digging into the sides of her box. Long day, she whispered, her voice cracking just enough to betray her. I think I'm ready for that dim sum now. Ryu's eyes drifted to the furrowed lines of her brow, the trembling of her lower lip, and the slight, defensive hunch of her shoulders. Then, his eyes fell to the paper in her lap. He reached out, his long, scarred fingers gently taking the document. He read the words theft and inappropriate conduct and fired immediately. The temperature inside the car seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ryu didn't explode, he didn't shout. Instead, he became terrifyingly still. It was the Blackshore instinct, the same cold, analytical fury that had allowed him to consolidate power across 2 continents. He saw the red mark on her arm where Sterling had pointed too closely, and the salt tracks of dried tears on her cheeks. Maribel, he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum of pure lethality. Look at me. She turned, her eyes swimming with fresh tears. I didn't do it, Ryu. I didn't take his watch. He screamed at me in front of everyone. He made me feel so small. Ryu reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted the murder in his eyes. He didn't offer empty comforts. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He simply took his phone from his inner breast pocket and tapped a single contact. Joe, Ryu said into the receiver, his eyes never leaving Maribel's. I want everything on a man named Sterling. Every debt, every secret, every woman he's ever spoken to. And I want the deeds to the Grand Celestia on my desk by morning. We're not just firing him. We're erasing him. Maribel leaned her head against Ryu's shoulder, the box of her honest life sitting forgotten on the floorboards. The sun had been eclipsed, and for the first time, she was grateful for the shadow. While Maribel slept in the safety of the Blackshore estate, a different kind of darkness descended upon the Grand Celestia. In a high-tech war room deep in Lower Manhattan, Ryu stood behind a wall of monitors, his face illuminated by the flickering blue light of scrolling code. Beside him, Gio and a team of silent specialists moved through the hotel's digital infrastructure with surgical precision. They weren't looking for a watch, they were looking for a soul. Sterling thinks he's a ghost, Gio murmured, his fingers dancing across a keyboard. He's been using the blind spots in the executive suite to conduct private business, but he forgot that the building's power grid and server pings don't lie. Every time he turned off a camera, he left a digital footprint of his location. Ryu didn't blink. Show me the money. The screen shifted, opening a series of encrypted ledgers hidden behind 3 layers of shell companies. As the silent audit deepened, the true depth of Sterling's depravity emerged. He hadn't just lost a watch to a gambling debt, he had been treating the hotel's employee pension fund like his personal ATM. Over the last 4 years, small, untraceable amounts, pennies on the dollar from the wages of maids, janitors, and kitchen staff, had been diverted into an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. It's nearly $4 million, Gio said, his voice tightening with a rare flash of disgust. He was stealing from the very people he spent his days berating. He targeted immigrant workers and those on work visas because he knew they wouldn't risk their status to ask questions about their retirement balances. Ryu's gaze sharpened. He saw the list of names Sterling had systematically drained, names of women like Maribel, who worked double shifts and lived in cramped apartments, trusting the system to protect their future. He didn't just humiliate her, Ryu said, the words falling like ice. He was preying on her entire world. There's more, Gio added, pulling up a hidden folder labeled disciplinary. He's filed 14 theft reports against minority staff in the last 2 years. Every single one was followed by an insurance claim. It's a cycle, Ryu. He frames them, fires them, and pockets the insurance payout to cover his losses at the tables. Ryu turned away from the screens, his coat billowing behind him like a dark omen. He didn't need to hear any more. The evidence was absolute, a digital noose tightening around Sterling's neck. Ryu had entered the night as a vengeful fiancé, but as the scale of the theft became clear, he became something else, a judge. Prepare the disclosure, Ryu commanded. We don't go to the police yet. I want the board members in that hotel by tomorrow morning. I want Sterling to feel the height of his power one last time before I pull the floor from beneath him. He wanted to make her feel small. Now, I'm going to show him what happens when you steal from the shadow. The morning air inside the Grand Celestia was crisp, filtered through expensive vents and scented with white tea, but for Mr. Sterling, it felt like victory. He stood in the center of the gold-leaf lobby, checking his bare wrist out of habit and adjusting his silk tie. He had slept soundly, convinced that Maribel Knox was a ghost of the past and his debts were halfway to being settled by the insurance claim he'd filed an hour ago. The heavy revolving glass doors turned, and a man stepped into the lobby who brought the entire room to a collective, breathless halt. He didn't walk like a guest, he walked like the floor belonged to him. Ryu Blackshore was draped in a charcoal overcoat that seemed to swallow the light around him. Behind him followed a phalanx of 3 men in sharp, identical suits, their expressions as unreadable as stone. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted instantly, the temperature seemed to drop, the chatter died away, and the bellhops straightened their backs in a reflex of pure survival instinct. Sterling's eyes widened. He didn't recognize the face, but he recognized the power. This was the anonymous owner, the phantom majority shareholder the board had whispered about for months but never met. Sterling practically tripped over his own feet as he scurried across the marble floor to intercept the group. "Sir. Welcome to the Grand Celestia," Sterling beamed, his voice oily with sudden, desperate subservience. He bowed slightly, his hands clasped together in a gesture of frantic hospitality. "I am Marcus Sterling, the general manager. Had I known of your arrival, I would have cleared the entire penthouse floor and prepared a reception. Please, allow me to personally handle your luggage." Ryu stopped. He didn't look at Sterling at first. He let the silence stretch, long and agonizing, as he pulled off his leather gloves. When he finally turned his gaze toward the manager, his eyes were as cold and deep as an ice-choked river. "You are Sterling?" Ryu asked, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I am indeed, sir." "At your service," Sterling chirped, completely oblivious to the predator standing before him. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You've arrived at a perfect time. I've just finished cleaning out some of the less desirable elements of the staff. We're tightening the ship, ensuring only the highest standards for our owners." A ghost of a smile touched Ryu's lips, but there was no warmth in it. It was the look of a man watching a fly walk into a web. "Is that so? You've been busy, then." "Incessantly, sir. One must be vigilant against those who don't appreciate the opportunities we provide," Sterling bragged, puffing out his chest. "May I escort you to the boardroom? The other directors are arriving now." "Lead the way, Mr. Sterling," Ryu said softly, stepping into the manager's personal space just as Sterling had done to Maribel the day before. "I've been looking forward to seeing exactly how you run my hotel." The mahogany-paneled boardroom of the Grand Celestia felt like a tomb. 6 board members sat in stiff-backed chairs, their faces pale as they looked toward the head of the table. Ryu Blackshore didn't sit, he stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his silhouette cutting a dark, jagged line against the New York skyline. Sterling hovered near the refreshment cart, his hands trembling slightly as he poured water. He could sense the shift in the room, but his arrogance blinded him to its source. "Sir," Sterling began, addressing Ryu's back, "the directors and I were just discussing the recent incident. We've already cleared the path for the insurance claim regarding the stolen timepiece. The internal investigation is closed." "Is it?" Ryu turned slowly, his eyes pinning Sterling to the spot. "Because my investigation is only just beginning." Ryu nodded to Joe, who stood by a large monitor. With a single keystroke, the screen flared to life, displaying a high-definition internal feed that Sterling didn't know existed. It showed Sterling's private office. The board gasped as they watched the footage, Sterling, looking frantic, taking a platinum watch from his wrist and carefully taping it to the underside of his own middle desk drawer before staging the theft by scattering his own files. Sterling's face went from pale to a sickly, mottled gray. That's a deep fake. That's fabricated. The metadata is encrypted and time-stamped, Marcus," Ryu said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, velvet whisper. "Just like the digital logs that show you diverting $4 million from the employee pension fund into an account in the Caymans." A cold, suffocating silence descended. Ryu walked toward Sterling, his steps heavy and deliberate on the plush carpet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, translucent evidence bag. Inside was the termination notice Maribel had been forced to sign, still wrinkled and stained with her tears. "You stood in my hotel," Ryu said, stopping inches from Sterling's face, "and you called a woman a thief to cover your own filth. You used her name, her race, and her status to build a lie because you thought she was disposable." Ryu turned to the head of security. "Search the middle drawer of the manager's desk. Use a crowbar if you have to." Minutes later, the guard returned, holding the platinum watch. The board members looked at Sterling with a mixture of horror and disgust. "You didn't just steal money, Sterling," Ryu said, his eyes burning with a cold fury that made the man's knees buckle. "You tried to steal her dignity. But you forgot one thing about the shadows." Ryu leaned in, his voice a low promise of total destruction. "They see everything. And they protect their own." Sterling collapsed into a chair, his mouth hanging open, the luxury watch reflecting the fluorescent lights like a mocking eye. The trap had closed, and there was no way out. The heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with a violent thud, but it wasn't Sterling leading the way this time. He emerged first, his hands jerked behind his back in the cold, biting grip of steel handcuffs. The tailored gray suit that had looked so formidable an hour ago now hung off his frame like a shroud. His salt and pepper hair was disheveled, a single lock falling over an eye that was wide with the panicked, darting look of a trapped animal. Two uniformed officers led him toward the elevators, but Ryu had ensured this wouldn't be a private exit. They bypassed the service lift, heading straight for the grand marble staircase that overlooked the main lobby. Downstairs, the hum of the hotel had reached a standstill. Word had traveled through the service corridors and the kitchens like a wildfire. The maids had stopped their carts, the bellhops had set down the luggage. They stood in a silent, informal line, a gallery of the very people Sterling had spent years belittling. At the center of the lobby stood Maribel. She was no longer in the dark uniform. She wore a deep emerald dress that made her skin glow, her cornrows styled with subtle gold beads that shimmered under the chandeliers. She didn't look like a victim, and she didn't look like a judge, she looked like a woman who had finally reclaimed her own name. As Sterling was marched past her, his boots scuffing the polished floor, he tried to look away, but the officers paused. For one agonizing moment, the predator was forced to face the woman he had tried to erase. The disposable face he had screamed at in the cubicles was now the only thing he could see. "You said I was nothing, Marcus," Maribel said, her voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent lobby. "But it turns out, the only thing that was nothing in this building was your integrity." Sterling opened his mouth to bark a final insult, but the words died in his throat as Ryu stepped up behind Maribel, resting a protective, lethal hand on her shoulder. The sight of the ghost of Blackshore, standing beside the woman he had humiliated finally broke him. Sterling's knees buckled, and he had to be physically hauled toward the revolving doors. The staff didn't cheer, the moment was too heavy for that, but a soft, rhythmic tapping began. One maid knocked her broom handle against the floor, then a bellhop joined in, followed by another, a heartbeat of respect that followed Maribel as she watched the police cruiser pull away. The walk of shame was over, and the reign of the shadow had begun. The Grand Celestia ballroom had been scrubbed of its past, replaced by an ocean of white lilies and the soft, rhythmic hum of a traditional Korean gaegeum blending with the deep soul of an Atlanta gospel choir. It was a fusion of two worlds, the iron-willed legacy of the Blackshores and the resilient spirit of the Knox family. Maribel stood at the center of it all, no longer a ghost in the hallways, but a queen in a gown of hand-stitched silk that shimmered like starlight. Ryu stood beside her, his hand never leaving the small of her back. The lethal stillness that usually defined him had softened into something resembling peace. He looked at her not as a prize he had won, but as the partner who had taught him that true power wasn't found in a closed fist, but in an open hand. As the evening reached its height, Maribel stepped toward the microphone. The room fell into a respectful hush, the wealthy directors and the hotel's service staff sitting side by side. She didn't speak of the jewelry she wore or the man who owned the building. Instead, she reached into the folds of her dress and pulled out a small, framed photo, the image of herself crying in that cubicle, frozen in distress, holding the paper that was meant to end her life. "A few months ago, a man tried to make me invisible," Maribel began, her voice steady and resonant. "He thought that because I wore a uniform, I didn't have a voice. He thought that because I was a maid, I was disposable. She looked toward the back of the room, where the kitchen staff stood in their white coats. I am standing here today because I was lucky enough to have a shadow that fought for me. But justice shouldn't depend on luck. It shouldn't depend on who you are engaged to. She turned to Ryu, who nodded solemnly, and then back to the crowd. Today, Ryu and I are announcing the launch of the Knox Foundation. We are using every cent of the multi-million-dollar settlement from the Sterling case, and an equal match from the Blackshore estate, to fund a permanent legal and advocacy center. We will provide 24-hour protection and legal counsel for service workers who face harassment, wage theft, or systemic abuse. A soft murmur of awe rippled through the room. Maribel leaned into the microphone, her eyes bright with a fierce, triumphant light. No one should ever have to stand frozen in an office while a predator tells them they are nothing. From this day forward, when they look at a maid, a janitor, or a server, they won't just see a uniform. They will see the foundation. They will see us. As she stepped back into Ryu's arms, the ballroom erupted into a standing ovation that shook the very foundations of the hotel. The sun and the shadow had finally merged, and in the light of their union, they had built a sanctuary that would outlast them both. The real work was just beginning, but as Ryu leaned in to kiss his wife, they both knew the world would never look at a nobody the same way again. Sterling thought he could bury Maribel under a lie, but he forgot that some shadows have teeth. This wasn't just about one man's downfall, it was the birth of a movement. If you believe every worker deserves dignity and every predator deserves a reckoning, hit that subscribe button. And don't miss next week's episode, The Night Maribel Saved Ryu. She thought she was helping a stranger in a parking garage. She had no idea she was saving the king of the Blackshore Empire. You won't want to miss how their real story began. See you then.